Story number 1. The Dark Closet. The night a shadow escaped. When I was a kid, around 7 years old, my family lived in an old 2-story house that had its quirks. My room, oddly enough, wasn't a traditional bedroom. It was more of a small space that connected to the attic. It was cramped, with low ceilings, and a closet that took up almost half the room. The closet itself was strange. It was elevated, and you had to climb a few steps to open its big, creaky sliding door. It wasn't just a place to hang clothes. It was stuffed with all sorts of toys, old boxes, and random bits of childhood clutter. Being up on my own little floor, separated from my family, always made me uneasy. The big closet loomed over my small bed, and I remember feeling a constant sense of unease, especially at night. It was after we watched a horror movie as a family that things really started to get weird. One night, as I lay in bed, my heart still racing from the scary movie, I heard a sound coming from the closet. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make me freeze. It sounded like a toy had tumbled off a shelf. Terrified, I bolted out of bed and ran straight to my parents' room. My dad tried to calm me down, telling me it was just my imagination, but he let me stay in their room that night. The next night, I had almost forgotten about the noise when it happened again. This time louder. It was the distinct sound of Lego pieces spilling out of their container and scattering across the floor. I didn't hesitate. I dashed to my parents' room, insisting that something was in my closet. My dad, growing annoyed, told me to go back to bed, but my mom promised we'd check the closet together in the morning. When we finally opened the closet the next day, I expected to see something out of place, and there it was. A pile of Legos was scattered across the floor, just like I had heard. My mom brushed it off, saying they must have fallen on their own. I wasn't so sure, but I tried to believe her. That night, my dad locked his door. Tired of my stories, I lay in bed, my heart racing as I stared at the closet, dreading the next sound. The room was silent for what felt like hours, but then I heard it. The closet door slid open with a loud, deliberate creak. The moonlight that filtered through my window lit up the figure standing in the doorway. It was tall and shadowy, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me like never before. I screamed, a loud, desperate scream that echoed through the house. The figure suddenly leaped down from the closet and darted out of my room. My dad rushed downstairs, trying to catch whoever it was, but they were already gone. The police came, but they never found anyone. To this day, I still remember the feeling of that night. The fear, the confusion, and the haunting image of that figure standing in the moonlit doorway. And the worst part, we never figured out who or what was hiding in that closet. Story number 2. When the past returned. The man no one ever found. When I was in 8th grade, my school organized a trip called the Louisiana Tour, a week-long journey through historic locations in southern Louisiana. One stop stood out above the rest: Myrtle's Plantation, a place infamous for being one of the most haunted locations in America. While I had heard stories of ghostly sightings and strange occurrences, I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. That was until we entered one of the rooms on the tour. As the tour guide droned on, talking about the plantation's long history, something strange caught my attention. A faint, repetitive sound echoed in the distance. At first, I brushed it off, but it sounded almost like a single note being struck on a piano, over and over again. I glanced around the room, expecting to see a piano nearby, but there was none in sight. I nudged my friends, asking if they could hear the strange piano note. They shook their heads, looking at me like I was imagining things. Still, the sound persisted. Confused, I glanced around the room again, and that's when I noticed a woman standing on the other side of the group. She was staring right at me. When our eyes met, she raised her hand and pointed to her ear, mouthing the words, "Do you hear it too?" I nodded, feeling a chill run down my spine. We weren't imagining it. Something was definitely there. Just as this silent exchange was happening, the tour guide began telling a story. A soldier had once lived and died at the plantation, and it was said that his spirit would play the piano late at night. Many visitors had reported hearing piano music with no visible source, just like what I was hearing at that moment. My heart raced as I realized I might be experiencing the very thing I had dismissed as folklore. As the tour ended, I approached the woman who had signaled to me. She confirmed she had heard the same sound, but like me, no one else around her had noticed it. Her husband and son looked puzzled as she explained, and it left me wondering, was the soldier's ghost playing for us? Or was it all just in our heads? To this day, I'm not entirely sure what happened in that room, but I'll never forget that eerie, unexplainable moment at Myrtle's plantation. Story number 3, Trapped in Terror. My nightmare came to life. It was just before Halloween when my friends and I gathered around a campfire, swapping ghost stories to set the eerie mood. One of my friends, Emily, hesitated when it was her turn to share. She warned us that the story she was about to tell wasn't your typical ghost tale. It was a true story about her parents' first date. Intrigued, we urged her to go on. Despite her reluctance, Emily's parents had a pleasant, albeit awkward, first date. After dinner, her dad had suggested they take a spontaneous midnight hike up Provo Canyon. He was familiar with the area, having spent many weekends rock climbing there. It seemed like the perfect way to extend the night under the blanket of stars. So they drove up to the canyon, parked, and started their hike, guided only by starlight, since there was no moon that night. As they ventured deeper into the canyon, Emily's dad began to feel uneasy. They were approaching a patch of trees, and something about the darkness ahead made him second-guess their adventure. But he brushed off the feeling and kept walking. A few minutes later, the uneasy feeling returned, stronger this time. Ignoring his gut instinct again, they pressed forward. Then, as they walked through the dark underbrush, Emily's dad suddenly tripped over something soft in the middle of the path. He stopped, trying to figure out what he had stumbled upon, but the darkness made it impossible to see. The feeling of dread that had been nagging at him intensified, and without saying much, both he and Emily's mom agreed it was time to leave. They turned around and hurried back to the car without looking back. Years later, after they were married, Emily's parents were watching a true crime documentary. The focus was on notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. During an interview, Bundy was asked to recount a time when he had almost been caught. Chillingly, he described a night when he had lured a young woman into Provo Canyon, killed her, and dragged her body onto the trail. He hid in the trees when he heard people approaching. He watched as Emily's dad walked straight into the body, stopped, and for reasons Bundy couldn't understand, simply turned around and left. The realization that they had narrowly avoided such a horrifying fate still sends shivers down Emily's spine, and it left us all speechless by the fire that night. Story number 4, The Figure in the Moonlight, a haunting memory I can't shake. Last year, while cramming for a deadline, I found myself in my school's library, well past 11 p.m. The library stays open until 2 a.m. for procrastinators like me, who wait until the last possible moment to finish their assignments. It's a small library, with most of the books stored in the basement, a section called the stacks. The stacks are divided into 2 large rooms on opposite sides of a long hallway. There are study desks scattered throughout, tucked between rows of shelves. Since I had a research-heavy paper due for my 8 a.m. class, I sat up at one of the study desks downstairs, hoping to save time from going up and down the stairs. Only one other student, a guy working a few desks down, was left in the room. By this point, I was pretty deep into my work, stressed but focused. That's when I heard it. Someone flipping through pages rapidly, making that unmistakable loud whipping sound. At first, I ignored it, thinking someone was skimming through a book in frustration. But after a few minutes, the noise persisted, growing increasingly irritating. Finally, I had enough. I got up to confront whoever was making the noise. But as soon as I took a few steps across the room, the sound abruptly stopped. Relieved, I sat back down, thinking it was over. But within 10 minutes, it started again, this time louder. It was as if they were flipping through a massive book now. I wasn't the only one getting annoyed. The guy a few desks over stood up and started searching the shelves, trying to find the source. The sound had gotten so loud that it was clear where it was coming from. I joined him in looking, but as we walked along the shelves, nobody was there. No one had entered the stacks, and given our positions near the entrances, no one could have left without us noticing. Confused, we both went back to our desks. I tried convincing myself it was just a malfunctioning fan, but my nerves were frayed. Just as we sat down, the noise erupted again. This time, it seemed to come from right next to the guy's chair. He grabbed his stuff in a panic, muttered something I couldn't catch, and bolted out of the room. I wasn't far behind. Since that night, I refused to step foot in the stacks alone, especially after dark. Story number 5. I saw him, but no one believed me. A few years ago, my wife and I embarked on a 2-day fishing trip off the North Atlantic, something we did regularly with my old fishing boat. The first day was pleasant. We made a decent catch, and in the evening, we enjoyed playing cards, listening to music, and taking in the peaceful atmosphere. But the next night changed everything. After a slow day on the water, we settled into our usual routine. This time without any music. It was quiet, just the hum of the boat and the sound of the ocean. Then out of nowhere, we heard the unmistakable sound of a boat motor. Startled, we rushed outside to see a small, old motorboat heading directly for us. With no lights, moving slowly in the dark. As the boat approached, we saw a middle-aged man at the helm. He had a scruffy beard and wore a worn-out baseball cap. The boat came to a stop right in front of ours, and I called out to ask if he needed help. He mumbled something about needing spare gas, so I apologized, saying we didn't have any extra. But when I asked if he needed a ride back to shore, he refused and claimed he had plenty of fuel. This struck me as odd. Why would he ask for gas if he had enough? The air between us grew tense, and the man just stared blankly at me. I could only see him thanks to the faint glow of our deck light. The rest of the ocean was pitch black. The silence stretched for what felt like forever, the tension almost unbearable. Finally, he broke the silence and casually asked if we had caught anything that day. I told him we hadn't, still trying to remain polite despite the growing sense of dread. I asked him how he was navigating in the dark without any lights, but he just chuckled as if I'd told a joke. Without answering, he slowly began to move away, but just as he drifted into the darkness, he cut his engine. I could barely make out the outline of his boat, sitting still on the water, but I knew he was there, watching us. The uneasy feeling was overwhelming. We retreated inside the boat, locked the doors, and pulled the curtains shut. The next morning, the man and his boat were gone, as if they had never been there. I never returned to fish in that area again. Story number 6. The attic door that should have stayed shut. In the winter of 2005, during my junior year of high school, something happened that I'll never forget. It was a Friday night, and like most weekends, my friends and I had gathered to play video games. After a few hours, the boredom set in, so we decided to go for a drive, as we often did. Matt was driving. Eric sat up front in the passenger seat, while Ryan and I were in the back. We had just dropped our friend Billy off at his house, and were heading back to Matt's place, driving down a familiar road. We'd driven this stretch countless times before, so nothing seemed out of the ordinary. As we rounded a curve and hit a long, straight section of the road, we saw something up ahead. There, in the middle of the road, stood a man, completely still, his arms hanging at his sides. He was about 150 yards away, and as we got closer, Matt flipped on his high beams. The man didn't move an inch, but now we could see him more clearly. He wore faded jeans, a red plaid jacket, and a camouflage baseball cap. What struck me most, though, were his eyes. They seemed to glow unnaturally in the darkness, reflecting the headlights like an animal's would. Matt slowed the car to a stop for what felt like several minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. We all just stared at the man in stunned silence. He stared back, completely motionless, not even flinching. The eerie stillness hung in the air. No one in the car said a word, but we were all thinking the same thing. Something about this wasn't right. Then, without warning, the man bolted. He sprinted off to our left, vanishing into the woods at full speed. Matt floored the gas pedal, and we sped away, hearts racing and adrenaline pumping. When we got back to Matt's house, the conversation erupted. We all agreed on one thing. Those eyes weren't normal. They seemed to glow in a way none of us could explain. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the headlights reflecting weirdly. But the more I think about it, the less certain I am. That night, something beyond the ordinary happened, and it still gives me chills to this day. Story number 7, Legos, lurking shadows, and a secret in the closet. About a week ago, my friend asked me to pick up a new vape for him. The shop was a 20-minute walk away, and since my phone was dead, I decided to go alone. The walk there was uneventful, and I managed to get the vape without any issues. However, the walk back was a completely different story. As I was heading home, I passed a group of people arguing loudly. At first, I didn't pay much attention to them. I figured it was just some random fight, so I kept walking. But suddenly, one of them grabbed me. I'll never forget the way he looked at me. Intense, almost threatening. He was wearing a black jacket with a gray hoodie, and his eyes locked onto mine as he said, "You heard what we were talking about, didn't you?" I hadn't heard a thing, so I quickly responded, "No, I didn't." But he wasn't buying it. "You sure about that? You look like you heard something." I was starting to panic. His grip on my arm tightened, and it felt like he was about to break it. He leaned in closer, his voice low and threatening. "You better not say a word, or we're going to do something about it." Terrified, I managed to pull away and started walking as fast as I could. I could hear them yelling after me, but I didn't dare look back. My heart was racing, and I just focused on getting home as quickly as possible. When I finally made it back, I told my friend everything. The whole experience left me shaken, and I haven't gone outside without my phone since then. It's crazy how something so normal, like a quick walk to the store, can turn into a nightmare in a matter of seconds. Story number 8. My childhood fear was real. The man who hid in our house. Late one night, I was relaxing in my living room, watching TV, when a sudden, loud thud came from the kitchen. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it might be the ice machine or something minor, but then the sound came again. Louder, more unsettling. I muted the TV and listened closely. It sounded like something heavy being dragged across the floor. Nervous, I got up to check. The kitchen was empty, nothing out of place. I inspected the doors and windows. They were locked tight. Trying to calm myself, I figured it was just the house settling and went back to the living room. Not 5 minutes later, the sound returned, this time coming from the hallway near my bedroom. My heart started pounding. Grabbing a kitchen knife for protection, I slowly made my way down the hall. As soon as I reached my bedroom door, the sound stopped abruptly. With a deep breath, I pushed open the door with my foot and scanned the room. Nothing. No one was there. I checked under the bed, in the closet, and even in the bathroom. Everything was empty. The silence was deafening. Feeling uneasy, I turned on every light in the house and stayed awake the rest of the night. But the noise never came again. At least not that night. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've heard the same disturbing sound twice more. Always in the dead of night. Always just before I'm about to head to bed. Each time, it feels more unnerving. Like whatever is making the noise is lurking, waiting for something. I still can't explain it, but the feeling that I'm not alone in my own home has only grown stronger. Whatever it is, it's watching, and I can't shake the fear that one night I'll find out what or who has been causing those sounds. Story number 9, From Closet to Chaos. A haunting I'll never forget. A few years ago, I was driving home late at night after spending the evening at my girlfriend's place. It was around 1 a.m., and I was on a desolate stretch of rural road with no streetlights and barely any traffic. The darkness seemed to swallow everything around me, and the only sound was the hum of my car's engine. I was tired but alert, eyes scanning the road as I just wanted to get home. Up ahead, something caught my attention. A figure standing by the side of the road. As I approached, I realized it was a woman. She was wearing a long, white dress that almost seemed to glow in the darkness. Her bare feet were planted firmly on the ground, and her head was bowed, with long hair cascading over her face, completely obscuring it. I slowed down, my instincts telling me to see if she needed help. But as I passed her, she didn't move. Not a single flinch. She didn't even look up, as if she wasn't aware of my presence at all. It was eerie, but I chalked it up to her possibly being drunk or disoriented. I didn't stop. However, a quick glance in my rearview mirror made my heart race. The woman had stepped into the middle of the road, right where I had just driven past. She was walking slowly, her figure fading into the distance behind me. My pulse quickened, and I pressed the gas, not daring to stop again. The unsettling image of her standing alone in the dark lingered in my mind the rest of the way home. Even now, I still think about that night. Who was she? What was she doing out there, all alone in the middle of nowhere at that hour? The questions have never left me, and I'll probably never know. But that chilling encounter remains etched in my memory. Let's get to the last story of the day. Story number 10, Screams in the Dark. The night I met a stranger in my room. Last winter, I went camping with a group of friends in the mountains, confident in our skills as seasoned campers. The forecast warned of a chilly night, but we shrugged it off, excited for an adventure. After setting up camp and enjoying a hearty dinner, we gathered around the crackling fire, sharing stories and sipping on drinks. Laughter echoed through the trees as we swapped ghost tales. But as the night wore on, the temperature dropped faster than expected. Soon, we were exhaling clouds of mist, our breaths visible in the freezing air. Despite our warm layers, the cold seeped through, sending shivers down our spines. Eventually, we decided to retreat to our tents for some much-needed rest. I shared a tent with my friend Dave, and as we settled in, the quiet of the forest enveloped us. Suddenly we heard footsteps crunching through the snow outside our tent. At first, We assumed it was just an animal, but the sound was heavy and purposeful, unlike anything we'd encountered in the wilderness before. Our hearts raced, and we held our breath, straining to listen. The footsteps drew closer, stopping just outside our tent. We exchanged glances, wide-eyed, our instincts screaming at us to remain silent. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as we waited, frozen in place. Then, without warning, the footsteps retreated into the darkness, moving away from our campsite and toward the depths of the woods. The tension in the air was palpable. We were too unnerved to sleep. The morning sun finally broke through the trees, casting a warm glow over our campsite. As we stepped outside, we quickly scanned the ground for any signs of the visitor from the night before. To our horror, there were no tracks, none at all, except for our own footprints leading from the campfire to our tents. A chill ran down my spine as we gathered for breakfast, sharing our unnerving experience. We all felt it, the presence in the night, an unseen stranger lurking just beyond the light. We packed up our camp, the eerie memory haunting us as we hiked back to the car, forever questioning what or who had wandered so close while we slept. Thanks for the watching. Please like, share it with friends and family, and subscribe to the channel.